While we all enjoyed the comically rotund dragon in Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, this somewhat inept adaptation of what is meant to be an adult red dragon is actually quite fitting as a representation of dragons as they're presented in D&D as a whole. Despite being in the title of the game, dragons in D&D 5th edition are not particularly well designed. And in this video, I'm going to talk through the reasons why I think that is and what dungeon masters can do to remedy this in their campaigns. Let's start by going straight to source and taking a look at the 5th edition monster manual for D&D. This book has a 32-page section completely dedicated to dragons, as well as a few other types of dragons scattered throughout the book. These include the dragon turtle, the shadow dragon, the draco lich, the wyvern, the pseudo dragon, and the fairy dragon. But each of these other dragon-like creatures has their own individual characteristics. I'd like to focus specifically on our core dragons, the chromatic dragons and the metallic dragons, as the section dedicated to these two main types of dragons takes up about 10% of the entire monster manual, and that section includes 40 dragon stat blocks in total. To top that, in 2021, Wizards of the Coast released an entire book, Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, which was wholly focused on dragons, but we'll get to Fizban's later on. Let's focus on our original monster manual dragons first. So, we have 40 core dragon stat blocks to look at, but what's the problem here? There's a lot of variety and a lot of choice for DMs, surely? Well, that is the root of our first issue. All of these dragons are basically the same. The variety that we can see is mainly cosmetic. Although there are technically 40 stat blocks in the book, there are really only 4. The Wormling, the Young Dragon, the Adult Dragon, and the Ancient Dragon. Beyond that, the only real differences across the stat blocks are subtle changes in statistics, and a different shape or damage type for each dragon's breath weapon based on their colour. Now, don't get me wrong, there is plenty of flavour text provided in the monster manual about the individual behaviour and personality of each type of dragon, which is great. But if your adventuring party have fought a few dragons in their time, maybe an adult red dragon and then a blue dragon, then a copper dragon, all of those fights are going to feel basically the same. All of that additional information just provides the illusion of diversity. We do, however, have some tools at our disposal to overcome this. First of all, we can lean very heavily into a dragon's personality traits and let that also impact their behaviour in a combat encounter. For example, by reading through the monster manual entry for a white dragon, we learn that they are vengeful. So in combat, perhaps this manifests as the white dragon focusing all of its attacks on the player that damaged it last. To get more variety in our dragon encounters, we can also use lair actions. These are different for each dragon type, and there is nothing stopping us adding lair actions to any type of dragon, even a wormling, as the lair section in the monster manual doesn't specify how old a dragon needs to be to get these lair actions. Unlike some other monsters in the monster manual, the lair action section for dragons doesn't even come with an associated challenge rating increase. Just bear that in mind though if you throw a single wormling at a low level party and give it lair actions, as this will significantly increase the deadliness of that wormling, even though the monster manual doesn't warn us about that. Then there are also regional effects, although the monster manual does specify that these only apply to legendary dragons, so that would be the adult or ancient varieties only. But you can always use your discretion here as a DM. If you'd like to give a young dragon regional effects, then there's nothing stopping you. The second issue to cover with dragons from the monster manual is the balancing of their breath weapons. A dragon's breath weapon is usually its most iconic feature, and each dragon's breath is slightly different, whether that be the damage type like fire or cold damage, or the shape of the effect, usually a line or a cone. Metallic dragons also get some additional options here if they don't want to just deal flat damage. The brass dragon, for example, has a sleep breath attack that it can use in place of its regular breath attack. And all dragon breath actions come with a recharge. At the start of a dragon's turn, it rolls a d6, and on a result of a 5 or 6, it gets its breath weapon back. All sounds great, right? Well, the problem here is actually that recharge roll. Although many things in D&D are down to chance, it is a game that revolves around rolling dice after all. This recharge roll for the dragon's breath weapon actually has a huge impact on how dangerous a dragon is on the battlefield. This essentially boils down to the dragon having a 1 in 3 chance of being able to use its breath weapon each round. Remember that on average, most combat encounters in 5th edition D&D take between 4 and 5 rounds total. The dragon will get a breath attack on the first round of combat, assuming they enter the battle with their breath weapon ready, as they pretty much always would do. And then for the duration of the rest of the combat, they will have 3 or maybe 4 chances to recharge their breath weapon. This means that statistically, most dragons are only going to get to use their most iconic move twice in one fight. I've run many encounters with dragons as a dungeon master, and I tend to find that they go one of 2 ways. Either the dragon gets multiple lucky rolls and recharges its breath weapon, able to use it multiple rounds in a row and absolutely devastates the party, or they get off that 1 free breath weapon at the start of the fight and then never succeed on their recharge roll, without ever getting to use it again. This typically results in the party stomping all over the dragon. This is because without their breath weapons, dragons are pretty rubbish in combat. They are just bland melee monsters that don't actually do a lot of damage with their standard bite or claw attacks. And then on the flip side, if they do use their breath weapon every turn, they become way too deadly for their challenge rating and will wipe out an entire party in just a couple of rounds. Let's do some maths to illustrate this point. We'll use the iconic adult red dragon as the sort of poster child for D&D 5th edition as an example. An adult red dragon has a challenge rating of 17, and following the monster creation rules from the Dungeon Master's Guide, we can recalculate and reverse engineer this to also come to that same CR of 17. Next, we'll run 2 scenarios. One where the dragon only gets a breath attack on the first round of combat, and one where it gets a recharge twice in a row, meaning it can use its breath weapon 3 times in the first 3 rounds of combat. And then just for comparison, I'm going to add in a bonus scenario where the dragon cannot use its breath weapon at all, where it would just have to rely on its melee attacks only. For scenario A normal dragon encounter, 3 rounds with a single breath weapon. The adult red dragon has a normal defensive CR of 13, and in scenario A an offensive CR of 22. This gives us an overall challenge of 17.5. And rounding this down to 17 gives us what we have in the monster manual, exactly what we would expect from this scenario. That means that the dragon's challenge rating is all based on the assumption that it does get 1 breath every 3 rounds, as we'd expect with a recharge roll on a 5 or 6. For scenario B, we're looking at a dragon who is lucky enough to recharge its breath weapon twice in a row after its initial breath attack, giving it 3 breath attacks in a row. Its defensive CR of course hasn't changed, that's still 13. However, its offensive challenge rating is now 23, bringing its overall CR to 18. And finally, scenario C. Maybe the dragon wasted their breath on an NPC or another monster, or blasted it up into the air to try and intimidate the party. So let's assume for the moment that it gets no breath weapon attacks at all in the first 3 rounds of combat. This gives an offensive CR of 18 and an overall challenge of 15.5, or rounded down 15. Okay, so we've played around a bit with the calculations. What does this actually mean for combat balance? What have we learned? Well, because of the inherent chance and randomness of the recharge mechanics, an adult red dragon's challenge rating in practice could be anywhere between 15 and 18. Or if we were looking at its offensive rating only, anywhere from 18 to 23. Remember, the dragon's defensive CR doesn't mean anything if the players are instantly wiped out by its fiery breath and don't even have a chance to retaliate. This variation might not seem like much, but depending on the level of the party, that could be the difference between a hard encounter and a deadly encounter. In raw numbers, there is a damage potential range over 3 rounds from 309 on the lower end to 519 on the upper end. That is TPK territory. And beyond just the numbers, let's remember that dragons are smart creatures. CR calculations don't really take into account the behaviour and intelligence of the monsters as they're run by the DM. All the challenge rating calculations assume is that a dragon will hit 2 party members with each breath attack. But for any of us who have run dragons or heard stories about dragons being run, we will all know of examples where dragons have been able to line up that perfect shot to catch the entire party in their breath weapon. And this is much easier to do for dragons with cone-shaped breath weapons than it is for dragons with line-shaped breath weapons. Unless the entrance to the dragon's lair is a perfectly straight tunnel, which could be the case. If a dragon does have a chance to catch all members of the party in a single breath weapon, then the upper damage limit that we talked about earlier goes up from 519 to beyond 1000 damage in just 3 rounds of combat. If we imagine this dragon that always tries to use its breath weapon optimally each round and recalculate the challenge rating, this actually sends their offensive challenge rating off the table in the Dungeon Master's Guide. It would be above 30. And beyond just getting an optimal lineup for your breath weapon, there are other tactics to consider that can make a dragon far more deadly in the right hands, or far less deadly in the hands of the inexperienced Dungeon Master. If you read any monster behaviour guides like The Monsters Know What They're Doing, or any of my videos on how to run monsters tactically in combat, you will already know that the smart thing for a dragon to do, and dragons are smart, the adult red dragon for example has an intelligence score of 16, is just to use hit and run tactics. Swoop by, use your breath weapon to hit as many of the party as you can, then fly away with your very fast flying speed of 80 feet, and stay out of danger until your breath weapon recharges. Rinse and repeat until your enemies are sufficiently toasted. There really is no reason for a smart dragon to stick around on the ground in melee, especially if it sees party members geared up in plate armor wielding magical and dangerous looking weapons. It's going to keep its distance and burn them from afar. This really is the crux of the balance problem with dragons. There is just a huge challenge gap between an inexperienced DM who has just had their dragon land and use claw attacks, waiting until their breath weapon is ready, and a veteran DM who flies around the battlefield and lines up those optimally placed breath attacks to hit as many people as possible. And the rechargeability on the breath weapon actually makes this worse for the inexperienced DM and makes the dragon far deadlier for the veteran DM, as the recharge will incentivize smart dragons to stay out of danger until their breath weapon, their best offensive maneuver, is available again. What this all amounts to is one of 2 situations, and let me know in the comments either from a player or a DM perspective if this is what you've experienced as well. Either the dragon becomes a walk in the park because it gets bogged down in melee combat and maybe has some unlucky rolls to not get its breath weapon back. Or the dragon flies around, skirmishes, has a few lucky rolls, has multiple breath weapon attacks, resulting in either the party being forced to flee or a TPK. And there's not usually much middle ground in between for dragon encounters. It either goes really well for the party or really poorly. And in both cases the DM is almost penalised for playing dragons strategically, as this will completely throw off their encounter balance, as we've seen with the CR calculations. Okay, time for a pit stop. Hearing some of that criticism of dragons in 5e, you might be thinking, yeah, I get it, I recognise those problems and I've seen this happen in my games. Or you might be thinking, no Nazir, you are blowing these issues out of proportion, dragons are fine, leave dragons alone. Both points of view are fine and everyone is going to have their own perspective on how dragons run in the game based on their own experience. But if you want to join in and continue this debate, have your say in the comments below. Alright, back on balancing. What can we do as DMs to manage this potential challenge rating issue? We could have the dragon behave differently based on how the fight is going. Maybe play strategically in the first couple of rounds of combat, see how the party are faring, and then maybe land and go into melee to give the party a chance to dish out some damage to it. To veteran DMs, this might seem like a bit of a soft approach going easy on the party, but remember, you as the DM, you get to play as a dragon. It's only fair that the party get to have some fun by beating one up. Alternatively, we could remedy some of these issues by tweaking the stat block slightly. If you want to stick with core rules still, by giving the dragon the variant spellcasting trait. This balances out the rounds a bit as it gives the dragon something more interesting and probably more dangerous to do in between those rounds when it's using its breath weapon. And spells are generally going to be a bit more effective on the battlefield than just using its claw or bite attacks. Another option, if you're open to a little bit of homebrewing, could be to edit the block directly. Maybe by reducing or removing the recharge on the breath weapon, but then also reducing the damage it deals or reducing the size of the effect to keep everything in balance. And beyond that, there is always the option of fully homebrew dragons from other third-party creators. There are a number of high quality and well balanced third-party books for 5e that have dragons in them. Things like the Tome of Beasts or the Monstrous Menagerie all offer some great alternative dragon options. The third and final issue I want to talk about when it comes to dragons from the Monster Manual is their action economy, because, well, it's not great. This isn't an issue exclusive to dragons. A lot of high CR monsters in 5th edition actually suffer from this, but dragons do have it particularly bad. In fact, if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you'll have noticed that most of the homebrew monsters that I draw up generally have some boosts to their action economy, essentially giving them more opportunities to take action during a round of initiative beyond just their regular action. Our base dragons from the Monster Manual have no bonus actions, nothing special to do with their reaction, and those dragons that do have legendary actions, which is just the adult and ancient variants, don't have particularly good legendary action options. Let's take a look at them. We'll use the ancient white dragon as the example this time. The first legendary action in the list is Detect. This action lets the dragon make a perception check. This is probably the worst legendary action I have ever seen on an official 5e monster. If you think you've seen a worse legendary action than this, let me know in the comments. I challenge anyone to find one. All Detect does is allows the dragon to try to sense hidden opponents off its own turn, but it is so situational. Realistically, the dragon is never going to need to use this action. Let's not forget, all dragons have dark vision, blind sight, and a very high passive perception, usually above 20 for the adult and ancient variants. It is just a completely pointless action. My guess here is that what they're trying to evoke by including this on the stat block is that moment that has become a fantasy trope, really originating from The Hobbit, where Smaug is sniffing around the treasure hoard trying to find Bilbo while he's hiding with the ring on, which is pretty cool cinematically but completely unnecessary here as a legendary action for a D&D dragon, as even that scene from The Hobbit, you're not in initiative, the dragon is out of combat, it can just roll a perception check whenever it wants. Why would it waste a legendary action on that? The only situation I can see where this legendary action may be remotely useful is where the adventuring party has a rogue who is trying to hide each round for that sneak attack bonus. In that case, this potentially allows the dragon to sniff them out, negating their sneak attack. But not every party is going to have a rogue, and rogues usually have multiple ways to get their sneak attack benefit without having to be hidden, so this still doesn't really make that Detect legendary action any more useful. Maybe in a party composed entirely of rogues, there's a bit of an edge case there, but otherwise I don't think so. Okay, back to the stat block. The next legendary action is a tail attack. This is just a basic, relatively low damage melee attack. And the last legendary action is Wing Attack, which costs 2 legendary actions to use. This can cause a little bit of damage in an area around the dragon and potentially knock creatures prone, as the dragon gets to use some of its flying speed to move around. Now pay attention, because you won't get to hear me say this very much when we talk about Monster Manual dragons, but this legendary action is actually really good. If the dragon needs to move, knocking your enemies prone will give them disadvantage on their opportunity attacks as you move away, and it gives the dragon a chance to jump into melee temporarily and leave without having to spend a full round of initiative stuck on the ground. This is a really well-designed defensive move, which is why it costs those 2 actions. Alright, so those are the 3 legendary action options for the Ancient White Dragon. What about the other dragons? What do they have? Well, there's the kicker, because remember what I said earlier about all dragons being basically the same monster, just slightly reskinned? Well, every single dragon has exactly the same legendary actions. Detect, tail, wing attack. Every single one just has those three, no variation whatsoever. Alright, enough complaining. What can we do as DMs to fix this? Using the rules as written, an easy fix, like we talked about already, is to use that variant rule and give our dragons some spells to cast. This is an easy way to give them some bonus action and reaction options. Consider throwing in things like shield, counterspell, or absorb elements that they can use as a reaction, and then things like Misty Step or perhaps even spiritual weapon that they can use as a bonus action. To maintain the theme of dragons as innately magical creatures, I would probably just stick to spells on the sorcerer list, as their spellcasting ability is charisma, but there really is nothing stopping you giving them cleric spells if you wanted to. You could have an ancient silver dragon, for example, who is a prophet of Bahamut, almost like a divine soul sorcerer, with both sorcerer spells and cleric spells still using charisma as their spellcasting ability. Going beyond the monster manual and doing a little tweaking, we could also grant some alternative legendary action options. For example, maybe allowing the dragon to use Frightening Presence as a legendary action, probably costing 2 actions to use to maintain that balance. I also really like some of the changes suggested in the Level Up Monstrous Menagerie. This is not an official book, it's a third-party supplement, but it adds in some unique legendary actions for each different type of dragon. For example, the black dragon can create an area of magical darkness, a blue dragon can cause a small earthquake, and a red dragon can entice one of its minions to make a free attack. So those are some ways to boost the dragon's capabilities directly and improve its action economy a little. But the main approach to improving the action economy of the bad guys in general is to use allies and minions as part of your combat encounter. More foes on the battlefield means more actions for the monsters per round. Even though we often imagine the big dragon as a solo boss encounter, these kinds of encounters are usually heavily weighted towards the party in terms of action economy. So when planning your encounters, always try to add in some minions to support your dragon if it makes narrative sense. So far in this video, I've thrown some quite heavy criticism at dragons as they were designed in the 5th edition Monster Manual, but let's at least give the game designers a chance to redeem themselves. Did the book solely focused on dragons, Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, attempt to fix any of these problems? Let's take a look. First of all, the book is chock full of extra lore on dragons and their behaviour, just in case that entire 32-page section in the Monster Manual wasn't enough for you. The 2 main additions we get to our core dragons are the introduction of Great Worms, a variant even more powerful than an ancient dragon, and the reintroduction to 5th edition of the Gem Dragons, giving us a new type alongside the chromatic and metallic dragons from the Monster Manual. Flicking through the stat blocks for the new Gem Dragons, we can already see massive improvements on the dragon design from the Monster Manual. The Ancient Amethyst Dragon, using this one as an example, has spell casting built into its stat block, plus it has some bonus action options and better legendary actions. Detect, thankfully, is nowhere to be found under the legendary actions, and instead we have a claw attack, psionics, which could include teleporting or casting a spell, and a unique area effect action, a little similar to the wing attack. And the same is true for the other newer dragons introduced in this book as well, and each one even has a unique legendary action specific to their type, unlike the Monster Manual dragons, which all had the same legendary action options. Then we also get the 3 Great Worms, a gem version, a chromatic version, and a metallic version. As with all of the other dragons introduced in this book, these are designed with action economy in mind. The gem variant has bonus actions and legendary actions, while the chromatic and metallic variants exchange their bonus actions for mythic actions, a relatively new type of action introduced in the Mythic Odyssey of Theros. All of these dragons also get way more action options to use on their turn, meaning they aren't solely reliant on recharging their breath weapon to remain a threat on the battlefield. The changes and improvements introduced to dragons in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons really are great to see, and it shows that the game designers are well attuned to the same issues we've identified in the monster manual, which by this point is almost 10 years old. The upgrades to dragons in Fizban's, along with the changes we've seen in the Monsters of the Multiverse book, gives a lot of hope for the further changes we are likely to see in the new version of the Monster Manual due to be released in 2025. I'm anticipating the newer versions of dragons in that book in particular to be far more exciting to run, and far more similar to those gem dragons we see in Fizban's. I'm looking forward in particular to see what kind of unique variations we may get across dragon types for the metallic and chromatic dragons like we saw for gem dragons, with some more unique legendary actions and maybe some more mythic actions too. I hope you've all enjoyed this one. If you have, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel Nazir North for more content like this in the future. And if you're interested in monster breakdowns and critique like this and you're looking for something to watch next, check out my Monster Manual breakdown playlist, which I'll link in the description below the video. Or check out those cards on the end screen to see what the YouTube algorithm thinks that you want to watch next. Cheers everyone, thank you for watching, I will see you next time.